Hello, everyone. I'm Lori Hearn. I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief of iNewsSource. I just wanted to welcome all of you to our first Spotlight Club event, albeit virtually in 2022. We'll be excited to talk a little bit later about a couple more events we have coming up, one next month, March 23rd. And we hope to have, drum roll, our first in-person event in June. So we hope we can begin to recreate those wonderful events we were able to have before the pandemic. So again, I want to welcome you to a somber but very important conversation we'll be having tonight about the threats that Mexican journalists face as they do their work in south of the border. iNewsSource is an investigative and accountability journalism organization, and we exist to try to make lives better here through our work. The Mexican journalists try to do the same in their country. Before we get started, Mark Rochester, our managing editor, will be moderating this discussion with two journalists who have practiced journalism in Mexico for many, many years. We'll just take care of a couple administrative announcements. First of all, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. And second, if you see the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen, please feel free to type questions into the chat as they come up. I'll be corralling those questions and we'll be asking those in the last half of this session. Finally, I'm going to turn over some explanation to Carlos, who is our interpreter today, for Sonia, who is a journalist in Tijuana, who will be sharing her stories with us. So Carlos, you want to explain a little bit about the interpretation function of Zoom? Okay, I think I'll turn things over to Mark Rochester, who is our managing editor here at iNewsSource, and he'll be introducing our guests tonight. Mark?
Thank you. So tonight, I think we're very fortunate to be hearing from two veteran journalists with firsthand knowledge and experience reporting from Mexico. Lynn Walker is president and executive director of Inquire First, a nonprofit journalism organization she founded in 2016 to organize Spanish language journalism workshops and provide reporting grants to Latin American journalists. She spent much of her career reporting for Mexico, where she served as the Mexico City bureau chief from '92 to 2008 for Copley News Service. Sonia Diana has been a journalist for 30 years, having worked the last 5 years in Tijuana. She's a member of the Baja California journalist group, Yo Si Soy Periodista, and a counselor for the state protection system for journalists and human rights defenders in Baja California. Sonia authored a very thoughtful opinion piece for UT San Diego earlier this month, and maybe she'll talk a little bit about that on the fatal shooting of Margarito Martinez. If you've had a chance to see that article, it really tees up much of the discussion I think we'll be covering this evening. So with that, I want to welcome both Lynn and Sonia to this panel discussion. And I think I'll just jump right in with questions. The first thing I was hoping we could talk about this evening is that Mexico has long been known as one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. More than a dozen have been killed in Mexico in less than a year. I was hoping you both could talk about what factors have contributed to this recent surge in violence. Lynn, maybe you could start.
Sure, I can start. There are a wide range of factors, and I'm sure it's different in each state and in each circumstance. But one thing is clear, there is impunity where it comes to killing journalists in Mexico. Rarely, if ever, is someone or several suspects arrested and convicted and sent to prison for the murders of journalists in Mexico. As long as there's impunity, there's really nothing, it breaks my heart to say this, that can stop this. In just 6 weeks, in the first 6 weeks of this year, 5 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. Where does this stop? And when does the government step in and say enough, and we're going to find and arrest and imprison the criminals who did this?
Sonia, do you have thoughts on this?
Gracias por el espacio y escucharnos en esta dinámica.
Truth be told, in Mexico over the past 15 years, in fact, it was just acknowledged by representatives from Mexico's Ministry of the Interior, we have seen an increase in crimes against journalists. This is something we didn't see so much in Baja California after the murder of Francisco Ortiz Franco, a journalist for Zeta, a weekly publication. So journalists in Baja California began to believe that this was something that would not happen here again. So we saw it as something far from the border. For example, what was going on in Veracruz and in Guerrero, where during Enrique Peña Nieto's administration, we saw an increase in attacks against journalists. What I believe is exactly what Lynn was saying as far as the impunity that not only impacts us as journalists, but that impacts society as a whole in Mexico. And part of that has to do with the involvement of organized crime with political groups, what we call narco-politics. Today, we have politicians who have ties to very dark interests at all levels of government. And of course, when a journalist sheds light or reports on these sensitive topics, they become an obstacle. So why not murder him or her when there are no clear examples of there being any prosecution, particularly the masterminds? They might catch the trigger man, the person who actually committed the murder, but not usually the mastermind. So that encourages them to continue attacking journalists. That, in addition to a hypocrisy that's coming from government, they've sold us this idea that we have a law that protects journalists, which sets forth that attacking or obstructing the work of a journalist is a federal crime. But this is a dead letter. It never, almost never, is someone prosecuted and sentenced for doing something of that nature. So crimes against journalists are the clearest expression of those who pretend to silence our voices. Further, they created this system recently, and I've been talking about that to people recently, and it's very difficult for them to understand when we tell them that Mexico has a journalist and human rights defender protection mechanism. What is amazing about that is that this mechanism addresses any reports of journalists who have been attacked or who fear for their lives, but 90% of attacks against journalists in Mexico have to do with reporting on public officials. So they created a mechanism that protects us against attacks from public officials mostly. And again, with the involvement of organized crime, which is mixed up with politics.
You both have spoken to some parts of my next question, but I'd still like to ask, crime and violence have become deeply rooted in many parts of Mexico. It's been reported that only 1.3% of crimes are solved in the country. And I wonder if, focusing on journalists, why has the government not given threats to journalists more priority in terms of investigation and prosecution? Why isn't this a priority for the government?
I'll start, Mark, but I really would love to hear what Sonia has to say about this. There's been a tendency of late with the current administration in Mexico under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador to openly, verbally attack journalists. That is in these daily press conferences that the president has. Just in the past few days, he's called journalists thugs and mercenaries and sellouts. And he has complained that he has been the most attacked president in 100 years. And what this does, as you can imagine, is open the door. It sounds like a signal like, well, it's okay. It's okay to attack journalists. And this is a very, very disturbing situation. And it's not stopping. In fact, in the past few days, it has gotten worse. And so I think that's just one of several things that we could mention.
¿Puedo hablar? Sí, por supuesto.
Of course, we have a president who, day in and day out, works on undermining the image of the journalists who value social media more. You need to look no further than his morning conferences, as he himself calls them. And these conferences, or whoever gets to ask at the conferences, are not journalists per se. We have influencers, we have bloggers, and we have no idea who is funding them so that they show up so early every morning. And they are the ones that shape opinion. They are the ones that try to keep pressure away from other journalists who would question the president's policies. And when he feels himself cornered or exposed, then he attacks, as we saw, for example, with Loret de Mola. Now, it's difficult for us as journalists to defend someone as Loret de Mola because although he is a good journalist, he has lent himself in previous administrations to other interests with the powers that be. So we don't identify with him. However, the constant attacks against Loret de Mola affect us all because Andrés Manuel is not only addressing him, he speaks against several journalistic icons, and he makes generalized attacks against journalism as a whole. He has sold the idea that we are an industry that misinforms the public and has misshapen public information for years, basically since the era of the Mexican Revolution. And that, of course, is part of that hate speech that comes from the presidency and then filters down to governors and mayors, and of course, with the Senate and the House of Representatives. Just look at what the Morena senators did. They held a press conference to criticize what journalists were trying to do, going as far as calling it treason, as if journalists were trying to sabotage the nation. So they elevated it to that level. So part of the problem that we're living through of this crisis of credibility goes beyond just protecting our good name, because they put us all in the same pool. And in part it is due because we have this system, this mechanism that puts everyone together. Journalists, bloggers, influencers are all protected under that mechanism. So when someone is attacked, there are influencers and bloggers who try to pass themselves off as journalists and ask for that protection, even when they may even be spokespeople for criminal groups. So Andres Manuel opened the door. Well, that door was opened by Enrique Peña Nieto's administration, that's true, but Andres Manuel, as a president, has been the one who has attacked the media the most. He does not differentiate between journalists, reporters, writers, bloggers. He puts everyone, again, in the same pool, and he is clearly discriminating against our industry, which makes us much more vulnerable.
What can journalism support organizations internationally and in the United States, such as the Committee to Protect Journalists, investigative reporters and editors, and other organizations? What can they do to help keep journalists safe? Lynn, if you could tackle that first.
Yeah, I mean, journalism organizations have been speaking out and speaking out loudly in these weeks of this year, with all of these murders of journalists in Mexico. Just the other day, the Inter-American Press Association called on the president to stop attacking journalists. Article 19 has weighed in. The Committee to Protect Journalists has weighed in. I think Sonia will speak to this too, but there has to be international pressure. I mean, if there's not, then it's just going to keep going like this, I'm afraid. I believe, and Sonia will correct me if I'm wrong, that President Lopez Obrador announced the arrest of 3 suspects in the killing of Lourdes Maldonado, which to me was a signal that he was feeling some of that international pressure, because I didn't think that he would do that in one of his many morning press conferences. And I thought that signaled some pressure that he was really receiving and feeling. But let me step back and let's.
Gracias. Efectivamente.
I think that would be the best way for international organizations to turn their sight to Mexico and see how journalism and good journalism is being done. Andres Manuel takes it as a personal attack whenever international organizations fund journalism work that will shed light on corruption, particularly corruption in his administration. While these organizations were funding journalism to shed light on other administrations' corruption, he saw it as good journalism. Look at the Casablanca example. He applauded that. And I'm not saying that was funded by international organizations, but today, during his morning conferences, he constantly alludes to the fact that there is foreign money that is attacking his administration, that is attacking his transformation project, even when what we're doing is shedding light on incongruencies that are going on even amongst his family. So the only way to face this crisis now as journalists would be with the support of international organizations that can enable us to do more investigative journalism and to have the backing of those publications, and for that work to be widely disseminated, no matter how angry Andres Manuel gets. There are those of us who are willing to continue doing this, even if it kills us. This is what we do. So we understand it. I mean, one thing is having fear, and another is to allow it to paralyze you.
And another couple of things, Mark, that I would add that I've heard other journalists say in Tijuana and other parts of Mexico is, when international correspondents are working in Mexico, the people who invariably know the most about the area that they're working in, especially if they leave Mexico City to go to another state to do reporting, are the local reporters. And finding them, hiring them, not calling them fixers, but calling them colleagues, and including them in the reporting and also in the credit when the work is published is also helpful because it shows that they don't stand alone. And that's really important. And we should not forget that as journalists.
I want to ask more about that in a second, but I wanted to ask first, how do Mexican journalists protect themselves and their families in Mexico?
Okay. Bueno,
Well,
hemos
we have designed some relatively archaic mechanisms, if that's the word, very basic. For example, we work together in WhatsApp groups. We let each other know that we are at X place or we just arrived at X location. We share our location in real time with the group. However, that hasn't really done a lot, to tell the truth. We've even created panic buttons involving elements of the army. But Margarito Martinez, the journalist who was murdered on January 17th, he was in that panic button group and he didn't even see the shooter coming. He was shot in the back and right on the head. They had offered to provide bulletproof vests. But what good does that do if you get shot in the back of the head, as has been the case for the most recent 2 murders in Tijuana? So the only way we can protect ourselves as a group is when we see that we're being watched. We report that in our groups. And what we do, if need be, is to report it publicly. We make it larger, more visible. Again, to try to counteract those attacks. Protecting our families is much more complicated because there are families who do get scared. Partners, spouses, relatives. Because many of us who live here aren't originally from here. We came from other states in Mexico. So the first thing that comes to mind for our relatives is that we're going to end up getting killed. And the first thing they tell you is, come back, leave town, go elsewhere. And obviously, that's not that possible. The reality is that very few leave. We know of very few displaced journalists. As far as I can remember, there's only been one who was a Reuters correspondent. But that's it. And she left over 5-6 years ago. So beyond that, I haven't heard of anyone else. So all we do is try to make our family understand that when they attack one of us or come after one of us, they're coming after all of us. You can't kill a snake by cutting off its tail. You cut off its head. You can't leave an animal wounded. Any good hunter knows that. You kill them. And they would never attack your family unless they can get to you first.
Lynn, this might be more a question for you. Do international correspondents face unique threats? And how important are, I know you don't like this term, or you prefer not to use this term, but how important are handlers or fixers or colleagues, as you refer to them? How important are those for U.S. journalists working in Mexico?
First, let me talk about the potential threat to journalists, international journalists working in Mexico. I don't diminish, that there is a risk, and I will never tell you that there is not. But what I will tell you is that, the few times that I was in a risky situation, I was able to extricate myself. And fortunately, I didn't, have anything to report or to be, lamenting afterwards. The thing is that international journalists are backed up by big international organizations, news organizations. And we are backed up by the CPJ and other organizations. And even more importantly, Mark, we can just get on a plane and get out of there. If that's the need, get to the airport and get the hell out of there. And this, as Sonia just said, is not an option for Mexican journalists. I know one Mexican journalist, I'm not saying there aren't others, who fled the country with the support of international organizations with his family, and they went and lived in Canada. And it was terribly difficult for them, terribly difficult for years. Now they're on their feet, and I think he's working at a university, but he really told a saga of difficulty, and he can't go back to Mexico. He can't go and see his family, his other, family that's there. So these are really not options for Mexican journalists. Now, in terms of working with colleagues in the localities where we're reporting, that is super important, because our colleagues in these different places in the country really know the lay of the land. And if they will do us the favor, the professional courtesy to work with us, because we're really asking a huge favor, if they will do that, they can warn us off of places, they can tell us where not to go. Then they can also save us time by saying, don't even waste your time with this person, they're not a good source. Oh, but this person, would be worthwhile you talking to. It's invaluable. And I owe so much to colleagues across Mexico, Mexican journalists who helped me out on all kinds of stories and went around with me and gave me their time and rode me in their cars, and photographer in their cars. And so it's really important. But I do think it's important then to give credit on the story. At the very least, a tagline, so-and-so journalist in this state, collaborated with us on this story, or contributed reporting to this story. So I think all of that is really important. And then, let's try not to forget to pay them if they would accept something, for helping us, because, another vulnerability is when you don't have finances. And, those who would do harm to journalists know that as well. So.
Lynn, in preparing for this panel, you told us about an incident where you were going to a rural area and you had a colleague with you, and they were able to talk you out of a kind of a sticky situation. Could you repeat that for our audience here?
Okay, now I don't even remember which one, because I've had a lot of colleagues talk me out of a lot of sticky situations.
You described it as being led into a dark room where people surrounded you in a circle, and you had to quickly explain your news organization, why you were there, what you were interested in finding out from this village.
Yeah. Well, one of those cases was in Chiapas, right after, a day or two after the armed uprising of the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And we went into a town where we had heard that there was something going on and there might be some Zapatistas there. And I sort of stood outside the little mayor's office and I was asking questions. And before I knew it, there were several concentric circles of men, not people, men around me. And they all wanted to know who I was and why I was there and why I was asking questions. And of course, Lynn being Lynn, I got out my presidential press pass and I said, well, who are you? I said, I'm not telling you who I am until you tell me who you are. Meanwhile, here comes a colleague, walks out, sees me encircled by all of these people, which is really not a good situation, and sort of begins to start extricating me, from the middle of that circle. These are the kind of, things and the help, the backup that we get and that we need, because sometimes we really do literally wade into something and it's out of hand before we know it.
I was wondering if both of you could talk about what motivates you to continue doing this kind of reporting under these very threatening conditions, And, are the risks worth it?
I'm going to let Sonia take that first.
Sí, pues es que
The thing is, when we decide to do this, we all know that we are working in the most dangerous profession, or at least one of the most dangerous professions in Mexico. We know of the risk. But once you get that bug, it's very difficult for you to leave. Not because you don't want to at times, but rather because no one wants to hire you anyway. Once you've been in media, you have that stench, let's say, because who wants a journalist in their ranks to start with? Back when I worked in Tabasco and came here after 20 years, no one wanted to see me in their newsrooms. I had been a journalist for 20 years and my curriculum wasn't doing me any good. It took me a year to get back into journalism media. And in my desperation to work, I even decided to sell insurance. And they gave me an interview after seeing my resume just to ask me why a journalist would want to do that. They couldn't understand it. They wouldn't even employ me as a salesperson. They think that you're going undercover so that you can watch them or something like that. And they just won't let you in. It's like a police officer in Mexico. Once you've been a police officer, if you leave the corporation or they kick you out, these people are basically unemployable anywhere else. So the only alternative that some of my colleagues have had is to serve as press managers for public officials or to work in public office in some capacity. But to answer your question directly, is the risk worth it? Yes. Once you realize that you're living in an unfair system and that you are the voice for so many people, you can't turn your back on sharing their stories or this crisis. And of course, that would make you someone that is in cahoots with the authorities. Regardless of the administration, they're all pieces of the same cloth.
I'll answer your question, Mark.
That's
but I
so well
wanted to-
said and very inspirational for those of us who believe in the power of journalism. So thank you for that. We're going to go to questions from the audience now, and I think Gloria is going to take over reading questions from the chat.
I just have one question I'd like to ask Sonia. I know that some journalists in Mexico seek protection from the government, which seems, after what you've said about the government, seems like a kind of an unholy alliance. Can you talk about what that is? My understanding is you were actually offered 24-hour protection, but then how can you do your job?
claro. Mira,
This mechanism, okay, let me put it this way. There's been so much hypocrisy in Mexico that when the mechanism was created, true journalists obviously didn't trust in it precisely because of what you just stated. How can I be protected by a government system when my attackers are part of that government? It is a contradiction in terms. So what did we do? We stayed away. We ignored it. But then the Mexican government was pressured by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission because the murders of journalists were increasing, particularly in Veracruz. So they decided to protect everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Because here in Mexico, we have the law for the protection of human rights defenders and journalists. And the law sets forth that anyone who issues opinions or publishes regularly on any media platform is to be considered a journalist. As a result, anyone who posts on Facebook is a journalist. Anyone with a Twitter account, Andres Manuel, is a journalist. He has social media presence. Anyone and everyone is a journalist. And of course, criminal groups. So a great gateway there. So they started fostering this. Since journalists refused to publish the messages posted by organized crime groups, they started creating characters. People who were willing to publish what we as journalists refused to publish, to not become their spokespeople. So an agreement was made, not just here, nationwide, basically. We saw this happening, that if someone was killed and they left a sign or these narco messages with them when they hung them from bridges, we would not disseminate that message. Again, do not become their spokespeople. So they went to influencers and bloggers and turned them into their spokespeople. And at the same time, the government of Mexico started implementing a series of limitations to freedom of expression to protect victims, to protect the accused, especially after the situation in Mexico with Floras Cases, a case in Mexico which Loret de Mola was involved with because of a montage. So a series of laws were passed that would regulate journalism. But they didn't go after influencers and bloggers. So this leads to a series of situations under the mechanism, which is publicly funded. So what happened, that we started having bloggers who, again, were spokespeople for organized crime of drug cartels, who were then protected by the state. Here in Baja California, we documented the case of Mariano Soria, a gentleman who would even post images of crimes prior to the police even arriving at the scene of the crime. The messages, without any restrictions, insulted the authorities, using the most vulgar words that you can imagine. And all of a sudden, he had a confrontation with the state police. And so he said that he was a persecuted journalist. The mechanism protected him, removed him from Baja California, took him to Mexico City, rented an apartment for him, put a police guard outside, 24/7 guards, and gave him a stipend so that the gentleman could eat. In the meantime, he continued publishing whatever he wanted without restriction, and he also threatened 4 journalists, including yours truly, and Dorelena Cortez, who is a nationally awarded journalist. So we were all threatened by him. And all protected under the same system. That's when we came to realize that we couldn't separate ourselves from the system, because this is the entity that the Mexican government invented, and we have to gain control of it precisely so that we can keep them from continuing to manipulate it. And this is how they're going to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission to say, look, we're protecting journalists, when they're actually protecting criminals. There's been a series of incredible abuses under this mechanism. We have a human rights defender in San Luis Rio Colorado who, with the police guard that the city assigned to protect her, goes out and attacks journalists and is still protected by that mechanism. So how do we regain control of that mechanism? By becoming involved. That's why I agreed to become a board member of the mechanism here in Baja California, precisely to fight against them protecting drug cartel spokespeople, and to ensure that when an actual journalist seeks protection, to be granted. We have the case of Margarito, the case of Lourdes Maldonado, which show the failure of that mechanism. But we need to take it back. We need to be the auditors. We need to be the oversight of that entity so that they don't continue to pretend with public funding that they're protecting us while they're killing us at the same time.
Thank you, Sonia. We've got a couple more good questions in the chat. Lori, if you want to.
Yeah, I was just saying this actually is a great opportunity for us to introduce to you Sonia Mijas Pasco, who is our new border and immigration reporter. It's the first time that iNewsSource has had the capacity to hire a border immigration reporter, but we obviously believe this is incredibly important coverage. And Sophia, I'd like you to introduce yourself and ask Sonia and Lynn your question.
Hola, Sonia y Lynn. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. My question was about the 3 people that had been arrested in connection with Maldonado's murder. Officials have said that her murder might not be linked to her being a journalist. I'm wondering, what will it mean for journalists in Mexico and for the public if the official story from the government is that Maldonado was not killed for being a journalist?
Claro.
Well, that's part of that denial. Trying to say that you didn't get killed because you were a journalist. The first thing the government wants to do is to find any elements, whenever a journalist is killed, to be able to say that you were a victim of, I don't know, crime of passion, that you were involved in illegal activities, and so your death is a consequence of that involvement. They've lost sight. Okay, look, there were red flags in the Lourdes Maldonado case. As you stated, they did detain 3 people who were apparently involved in the murder. And these are people who, in one way or another, had ties to criminal groups, or who have a history of having been involved in being street dealers. But in addition to that, as incredible as it may sound, the district attorney's office asked the judge to not allow journalists to be present during the hearings where these people are being prosecuted, arguing that one of the witnesses was a minor. So we can't rather enter the courtrooms and see what's going on, because the government wants to feed us whatever they want us to know. We get these index cards from the hearings, and that's what we're supposed to do. So they communicate to the outlet they want the information they want to have out. But they're not providing us access to these hearings, precisely because they're covering something up. The president of Mexico is supposed to visit Tijuana tomorrow.
Can I? Yes, I was just going to say, we have another question here that's kind of along the lines.
Okay.
But it maybe will help for some background. Do you know if this question comes from Richard Dahlberg? Do you know if the stories being worked on by the slain journalists, were they similar in subject matter, or were they a variety of different topics, or were they all having to do with, for example, cartels?
No. Lourdes Maldonado was not currently working as a journalist. She was at a stage where she was working as a blogger. So she was posting her own opinions on her social media platforms. So she was no longer doing investigative journalism. If she found out about any issues, of course, she would report it on her platforms. But she was no longer doing investigative journalism. That is why they're trying to say that it didn't have to do with her being a journalist. But we all know that Lourdes had a work-related issue, and so she went to the morning conference given by the president and asked for his help on the matter. Now, of course, that is not a journalism-related issue. It was a labor issue. But these 3 people that detained could have been paid by anyone. If these people can be at the service of organized crime, why not at the service of a politician? And there's an interest in covering up the motive and the mastermind. That's part of the whole system. So we're waiting for López Obrador to be here tomorrow and give us the revelation of the year, because Margarito Martinez was murdered 6 days before, and it was clear that organized crime had an interest in attempting against his life, and we've seen no progress. And Lourdes Maldonado reached an international notoriety that Margarito Martinez cannot achieve.
So I know you had said earlier, Sonia, that one of the ways that you can defend against these threats and this violence is by making sure that you're not overshadowed, or that your story is amplified so people hear about it and they can be concerned. One question I had is, what can the news organizations do? Do they have much power? Lynn was talking earlier about the journalists, the international correspondents that go to Mexico are often backed by very large, wealthy news organizations. I would suspect that is not the case in Mexico, but maybe you can enlighten us.
Journalism organizations in Mexico are, or have been, weakened, the formal ones anyway. If they could continue funding investigative journalism to look into irregularities, that would be a good way to support journalists so that these articles can be published on domestic and international media. And what Lynn was saying is very true. These fixers she spoke of, which are the local journalists that advise international correspondents, need to get recognition and perhaps even share awards if an international journalist gets an acknowledgement of the work that was done in Mexico, to also acknowledge those fixers that helped them and went with them and kept them safe. Because our role, when we're asked to play it, is to keep that correspondent away from danger. Although there are some correspondents that actually have personal guards when they come. But it doesn't mean that nothing can happen to you, even with that protection. So that is the one way that international organizations could help us, at least for now.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here too. Has the continued violence against journalists had a chilling effect on the willingness of media outlets based in Mexico to stand behind the journalists publicly, particularly on tough stories, or even with their willingness to publish the stories?
No,
Obviously, journalism is very versatile. And there are certain interests behind journalism pieces that aren't very healthy, let's say. And there are journalists who lend themselves to that. That is clear. But each of us set our own price. And we all know what our work is worth. I think it is rather think about how we sell ourselves and how we sell our work that can elevate what's being published. But there aren't any strong organizations that have become a national movement yet. And our president just this morning was saying that he acknowledged these attacks against journalists, but he was worried that people were using the murders of these journalists to attack his government when it is our blood that's being spilled.
Mhm. So we're almost to time here. If anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. But I would like you to talk a bit, Sonia, about the organization in Mexico, the journalism organization that helps journalists. It's an organization that people all over can contribute to help. So maybe you can tell us something about that organization, what it does, and how it helps journalists in Mexico.
Sí,
Our organization was born as a collective, precisely to report on what was going wrong with the journalist protection mechanism, and of course protect ourselves in our journalistic work. But we also realized that one of our greatest vulnerabilities is the fact that when it comes to our work, we don't have any of those supports. A maquiladora employee has better benefits than a journalist. There are journalists who are earning the same wages as a maquiladora or twin plant employee, but that employee has a set schedule, has days off, and gets benefits. They have medical insurance, they have access to credit for buying a home. A journalist does not. As amazing as it may sound, even private insurances don't want to insure us. We have tried to get quotes for journalist insurance, and as soon as they find out we're journalists, they deny it. They don't want to give us credit. So you have to work on it over time, but if your one reference is that you're a journalist, you're just not going to get it. So there's a whole series of systems that force a journalist to live day to day. And of course, that makes us vulnerable. Regardless of, as in the case of Lourdes Maldonado, who shed light on a labor issue and fought it, and it never moved forward over 9 years. And journalists give up on their fight because no one wants to fight against the heads of a large media outlet. So again, this keeps us from having the necessary tools to face illness or to face emergencies. For example, if there's a traffic accident, you have no money to fix your car, and so on. So we started working towards a foundation that is now called I Am a Journalist, Yo Sí Soy Periodista. And through that foundation, we have raised funds for colleagues who get sick or who face catastrophic events. So we have raised funding, for example, to pay for funerals, or we call it a disaster fund. And we are covering the cost of crises that our colleagues face. We organize races and raffles and whatever activities we can come up with. And I was asking because Lynn had asked me whether we could accept funds from abroad. And I have asked, and our bylaws do not allow for that. We would have to amend them, or establish a different mechanism through which we can receive cash funds. For example, on the 13th of this month, March 13th, we're going to have a race to raise funds to provide a scholarship to Margarito Martinez's daughter. She is 16, and she is now fatherless, and he was the main provider for that family. So as a foundation, we made the commitment of making sure that this young woman will not need anything in order to complete her studies.
Thank you, Sonia. We have another question from...
I had one more question I wanted to ask. Sonia, I was really surprised in looking at the Committee to Protect Journalists website and looking at their report, their latest report on killed and missing journalists. And according to their information, there's just so far this year, there are 66 Mexican journalists who are missing, which is just a staggering number in my mind. Are we in the US underestimating this problem? Is this problem, when you look at journalists who are killed and journalists who are missing, and I have to assume that they're presumed dead, are we underestimating the seriousness of this problem here in the US?
Pues la única manera.
The only way is to continue to disseminate that a journalist has gone missing. But again, we have this institution that is invalidating the fact that it is due to their being journalists. To begin with, people go missing in general. You don't need to be a journalist for no one to find you. And if you're a journalist, even less so, because most likely they'll make up something. And unless your media outlet and all your peers insist on the fact that you've gone missing and you need to be found, only through that pressure and through that national and international press observing, perhaps we could achieve something. But Mexico is the mecca of missing people. I saw a case personally in Tabasco where a journalist went missing and the district attorney's office made up that perhaps he had gotten into a fight with his wife or his girlfriend or whatever it was. And months later or a year or two later, it finally came out that he had been murdered, that he had been cut to pieces, that they actually cut him while he was alive. And then they burned the remains. And at the end of the day, there were only 5 little bones of what used to be this journalist. He was a journalist for Tabasco Hoy, Tabasco Today. And the case is clearly documented. But initially, during the first couple of months, even ourselves as journalists didn't know that he had gone missing. We didn't find out until 1 or 2 months later that one of us had gone missing, because not even his outlet let anyone know. So it needs to be something that we as media need to work on together. That's why we need to be all connected, so that if one of us goes missing, to have a relative that has the phone numbers of other journalists so that they can report on it and we can shed light on it. That's the only way to get it done.
Sonia, we hopefully have time for just one more question. There's so many things we could ask you. I'm going to kind of roll this into one question. Can you talk about whether there are journalism schools in Mexico, and how is the attendance? Are people still eager to be journalists despite everything you've told us tonight? And the second part of that question is, does all of this particularly recent violence give you really concern about the future generation of Mexican journalists and whether there will be a further diminishment of the profession?
There are very few journalism schools as such. I believe there might just be 3 of them. One's a private school, Carlos Septiem Garcia in Mexico City. Another school of journalism is at the University of Chihuahua. And beyond that, it might just be those 2. They're the ones I remember. The rest of my peers mostly have degrees in communication sciences. And that's where a lot of our journalists come from. That degree is one of the most sought after at all universities. The advantage of that is that not everyone graduates with a journalism profile. So when they realize how little it pays and how few benefits they get out in time, let's say. But there are still people who want to become journalists. The younger generations have not been discouraged by what's going on. At least we haven't noticed less people with communications degrees who are willing to become journalists. In fact, they want to become journalists so badly that they give away work for months so that they can get connected and be able to formally enter the profession at some point.
Well, I just really want to thank you both, Lynn and Sonia, so much for your stories. This has been a really special evening. Sonia, you have all of my respect and for what you do. We think journalism is hard to practice in the United States, but nothing like what you've been telling us tonight. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending. Mark, do you have any final words?
No, I think what you just said was so well said. I think it captures all of our respect for the work that you're doing and the sacrifices you're making in order to do truth telling.
And I'll just add, I hope you and Sophia can get to know each other as she starts to carve her way into the border and immigration beat for us. I know you would be an incredibly valuable resource for her, and we would appreciate any wisdom you can impart to her.
Lori, if you would let me just say a special thanks to Sonia, really for, taking her time to come and talk with us in this very frank and open way. I could not begin to emphasize enough how much I respect Sonia and all of our colleagues in Mexico. They're really doing the impossible. They're doing things that no one would believe anyone would be willing to do. And yet they're out there on the street every day, trying to get the information, trying to tell the truth, and they're doing it for the good of the people of Mexico.
Thank you, Lynn. Very well said. Thank you, everyone. Just as a reminder, I just want to thank you all so much for your support of iNewsSource and the work we do here and will be doing along the border and in Mexico. I want to tell you that we do have another Spotlight Club event scheduled for March 23rd, which will be another virtual event. This time we'll be hearing from Dick Toffel, who's kind of a media guru. He was one of the founders of ProPublica, a large nonprofit in New York. He now consults after his retirement on the media industry. As I mentioned in June 5th, which is a Sunday, we hope to reinstate our in-person events. And we have Dick McCraw coming in, David McCraw, sorry, coming in. He is the New York Times newsroom attorney and handles everything from pre-publication to helping to get the New York Times Afghan colleagues out of Afghanistan at the very end there. So he has a wide range of experience in the news business. So I hope that we'll be able to have him here in person so you can meet him yourself and ask him your questions yourself. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you so much for your support of iNewsSource. Have a good evening.
Good night, everyone.
Gracias por la atención. Un abrazo a todos.
Good night. Thank you.
Gracias, Sonia. Buenas noches.
Gracias, buenas noches.
Mucho gusto.
Gracias, Sonia.
Para servirles y con gusto, aquí estamos. Si en algo los podemos ayudar, Lynn tiene mi teléfono y solamente tienen que marcar.
Muchas
Good
gracias.
job.
Muy amable.
Gracias mil, Sonia. Un abrazote.
A tus órdenes. Bonita noche.